Well, thank you very much, and greetings from what I call the wild west of Wales. I thought I'd begin just by giving you a bit of an outline of the path that I've taken through life, because I find it always helps you to sort of connect with the speaker, so you know where I'm coming from. And I was brought up in Leicester, basically. I was born in Birmingham, but I was brought up in Leicester. And I went to Sunday school till I was age 9. My parents were both from Glasgow, so it was a Presbyterian Sunday school. And then, this was the beginning of the 1960s, and my father stopped going to church, sort of like society gave him permission not to go to church. And he took me swimming instead, so it was a no-brainer for me. And I was brought up in Leicester, went to school there, went into the science stream, as you did then. You either had to choose between the science and the arts. So I had a scientific education, and I went and did a science degree, and I ended up teaching science in a secondary school in Leicester. And science fascinated me, but it didn't answer all the questions. And as time went on, there was a very big question that came up in my life, which was because my wife became seriously ill with a mental illness, with depression. And as a result of that, we tried out various complementary therapies. And then we got interested in the ecology party and the New Age, as it was called in those days. And through growing interest in things which were sort of on the edge of science or beyond science, I gradually came to a belief that maybe there is a God of some sort. And we got involved then in various cosmological writings and teachings. I don't know if any of you have read any of Alice Bailey, or Helena Blavatsky and Theosophy. And I studied that for some 3 years or so, and meditated with some of the teachings there. And came to an understanding of something called Christ consciousness, that there was a level of being that was different from the normal level of being. And then in the middle of that, I somehow got catapulted into evangelical charismatic Christianity. How do these things happen? But it was very healing. It was a church, a big church in Leicester, and we were embraced by them. We were in the middle of a difficult time with my wife's depression and so on. And the love from the people was what drew us there. I hadn't a clue what the service was about, and all this sitting up and standing up and sitting down and reciting things together. And then as time went on, we got involved in the church there, and eventually after about 9 years I went off for ordination training, became a priest, but began to start exploring mystical Christianity. And then we got involved with meditation and contemplative prayer, and gradually the whole thing broadened out, and I began to start thinking about, well, what about all that other stuff that I was studying before I was a Christian, before I'd become into the church, as it were. And I spent quite a few years wondering and thinking about that, and how I could put together somehow the scientific ideas, the Christian ideas, and the sort of metaphysical ideas that I'd been studying before. And that's where the book came from. That's where the Blue Sky God came from. I called it Blue Sky God because I wrote it on that coastline, surrounded by the blue sky, and it's sort of some blue sky thinking. It's out of the box thinking. And I find that in meditation, I come before God and I try to still the mind, and in some way become aware of God consciousness. And it's the idea of consciousness that really interested me in recent years. It seems to me that science is at last sort of catching up with the notion of consciousness. A lot of scientists have spent many hours and days and years and so on studying what is consciousness, trying to work out what it is. And we know we have it, but we don't know how or why we're able to ponder on things. And yet our consciousness seems to be growing, changing, evolving in some way. There's a famous physicist, Sir Roger Penrose, that said this. He said, "My position on consciousness demands a major revolution in physics. I've come to believe that there is something very fundamental missing from current science. Our understanding at this time is not adequate, and we're going to have to move to new regions of science." Sir Roger Penrose is a leading edge physicist. So I want to begin by painting a bit of a picture of reality as scientists understand it today. Forgive me if you know all this, but we live in the world where there's a kind of dawning, growing understanding that the nature of reality is in actual fact very different from the way that we've always understood it. Slowly there's this kind of downward trickle from the scientific world that says that we live in an existence that's composed of energetic information fields, not solid matter. We see it, as solid, we feel it as solid, but actually it's all forces interacting with each other. One neurophysiologist, Mary Schmidt, expressed it well. She wrote an essay called "If All Is Consciousness, What Then Is My Body?" And in a playful way, she describes what it's like to look down an electron microscope. This is in the range of 1/1000th of a centimetre. Very small. And she says, "In that domain, the body appears more like a vast sea inhabited by many types of creatures. Ocean caves, pores of the skin, seem to be inhabited by various sea creatures, bacteria. Nerve cells of the inner ear look like sea anemones, and the taste buds as beautiful flower arrangements. Sea snakes piggybacking giant sea lions are actually muscle tissue with nerve fibres running along the surface," and so on. And the body at that level is still seen as solid matter, real but rather strange. Going to a much greater magnification still, about 100 millionth of that size, and it's about 10 to the minus 14 centimetres for those who are mathematically minded, we come to a domain where all the solidity is gone. At that level, if you could magnify it that much, you would see each atom of which the body is made. Now, the simple model of an atom, the sort of thing that you learnt at school, is of a central nucleus surrounded by electrons whizzing in orbit round the nucleus. Well, if you take that model and if you were to enlarge the nucleus of the atom to the size of a speck of dust, then the electrons whizzing round, as it were, would be hundreds of yards away. That's the kind of scale that we're talking about. And in between is kind of nothingness, emptiness. And she makes the delightful and sobering point that if you could get rid of all the emptiness within our atoms, we could fit on the head of a pin with room to spare. I think that's actually Mitt Romney, who disappeared into America somewhere. It's an amazing thought, though, really, that all the seemingly solid stuff of which we're made is nearly all emptiness in a way, and could fit on the head of a pin. Going further still, she enlarges the magnification to the subatomic level, and we get down to the atomic particles, leptons, quarks, all the strange names that they have. The muons, gluons, photons, neutrinos, and the famed Higgs boson that was discovered a couple of years ago, the so-called elementary particles. And at that level it becomes difficult to refer to our bodies made of matter at all. The quarks in the top there, the physicists have great fun naming these things. You can see they've got the names up, down, charm and strange, and top and bottom. Well, charm was named so because it seemed to lead a charmed life, and strange had some very strange behaviour. And you know, the physicists have their little jokes, don't they, with these names. And gluons hold things together. You know, you might imagine that. But what Mary Schmidt said about this was that the hundreds of subatomic portions of the protons and neutrons of the nucleus, such as leptons, mesons, quarks, etc., those spoken of as particles, are not so much entities as intelligent vibratory patterns of interacting, communicating energies. Some of these so-called particles can go backwards in time and in and out of existence. And that's the level that these are the things we're made of. It's the nature of the reality of our bodies and of everything. That we're essentially vibratory patterns interacting, communicating energies at a much more subtle level than was imagined even only 50 years ago. And even time and space are not actually fixed. And at that level we begin to see connections between matter and mind, consciousness. Because you and I are not separate. We are all interconnected. Our energy fields are reaching out right now, way beyond our bodies, and we're interacting with each other at subconscious levels. Your energy field from your heart, the electromagnetic energy from your heart, it reaches out a long way. And you know when you go into a room and you kind of feel that there's something been going on here between these people, or there's an atmosphere. You don't register it in your brain, you register it somewhere else. And just a very subtle feeling that you can easily ignore and miss. But actually, it's your energetic fields interacting with each other. I do believe that that is, via energetic fields, is the way that a lot of complementary healing works. I won't go into all that, but that's another issue. If we continue magnifying, we get down to the unimaginably small, 10 to the minus 33 of a centimetre, or Planck's constant. Max Planck was a contemporary of Albert Einstein. And Planck's constant seems to be about as small as nature wants to go. It reflects the size of the quanta, the packets of energy in the quantum theory. And that was discovered by Max Planck in 1899. What a long time ago. It just shows you how long it takes for scientific knowledge to gradually trickle down into general awareness. We get quantum this, quantum that, quantum the other these days, but that word was used right back, well, back in the 1920s it really came into being. But at that level of reality, that 10 to the minus 33 of a centimetre, Mary Schmidt said this: at this point we can no longer speak of space or time or even of manifest reality. We are an implicate order, as the physicist David Bohm refers to, where nature does all her creating, holds all her memories, and where what exists is infinite potential. We are in the realm of the unified field. I am one with all that is in the timeless domain of infinite complexity but utter simplicity. I am one with all that is. This is a neurophysiologist saying this. And it's actually what spiritual traditions have been saying since time immemorial, that there is only one. And we are one with the all. It gets dressed up in different language. But that's essentially what we're saying, is that our consciousness is an aspect of the divine one consciousness that sustains everything in being. St. Paul's phrase, God is the one in whom we live and move and have our being. And the wonder of it all is that this this time, in this cultural and spiritual moment, when we've gone global and when we have the technology to see that we're all one, then science is beginning to say the same thing, that there is a one consciousness. You see, for many years, oh, there's the one consciousness. Pretty little thing, but there we are. For many years, conventional science has taken the perspective that matter is the building block of all things, and there's what's called upward causation. So life and mind and consciousness arise from the building blocks of matter as it becomes ever more complex. So in the beginning, atoms combine to form molecules. Molecules get larger and larger, more complex, until eventually organic molecules are formed, and from those organic molecules life somehow emerges, and gradually over the eons life becomes more complex, so the brain develops to coordinate that complexity, and from the brain tissue eventually pops out consciousness. That's kind of the standard way of looking at it, the conventional view, part of the backdrop to Western society, if you like. But there's a new paradigm emerging in scientific thought, and it comes from quantum science, this strange world where the tiny particles behave in weird ways that defy conventional thought. The new way of looking at it says that consciousness is prime. That it is the prime mover in the universe, and that we're all part of that consciousness, and that the world of matter arises from the collapse of quantum energy waves into particles, brought about by the effect of consciousness on them. In the world of quantum mechanics, subatomic particles are not really particles at all. They exist as sort of waves of potential smeared out, like over space. An electron, for instance, exists not in one location, but as a wave of possibilities, of potential locations. And this relates to Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. The location of any particle is actually uncertain. What brings about the actuality of an electron from all the possible locations is being observed, which kind of sounds ludicrous. But numerous experiments have shown this. To give a bit of an analogy with that, it's a bit like rain forming from water vapour in the air. Water vapour is invisible and it's everywhere, but when the conditions are right, it condenses into a tiny drop and becomes visible. The clouds in the sky, they're tiny drops of water vapour. Similarly, when conditions are right, energy waves become individual particles that we can see and feel. But what causes them to become those particles is being observed. One physics professor, Amit Goswami, puts it like this. He says, before observation, the electron does spread all over space, but only as a wave of possibility. Observation brings about the collapse of the possibility wave into an actual event, a particle. That's from his book, The Physics of the Soul. Put it another way, consciousness brings about reality. The physicists say that subatomic particles are observed into material existence. In order for this energy wave to collapse and become a particle, it has to be seen somehow. And this is gradually bringing about a turnaround in scientific thought. It's taken 80 years to percolate down from academia. Basically, the quantum insight says that if there's no consciousness in the beginning, the particles would never have come into existence, and the material world that we live in and are part of would not be. So in the new understanding, it's consciousness that's the starting point. Consciousness is prime. It's mind before matter, if you like. And downward causation happens as consciousness causes matter to come into being through the collapse of quantum energy waves into quantum particles. To put it very simply, the universe doesn't seem to exist without a perceiver of the universe. And as another analogy, think of a laptop computer. Laptop computer contains a universe of possibilities for things to do. It can show beautiful pictures, play gorgeous music, write elegant prose on it. So all the potential, all the information inside it to do those things. But until the consciousness of a person acts on the laptop computer, nothing appears at all. It's got all the potential, but you need consciousness before anything happens. In the same way, energy waves exist in the universe with all the potential to form material particles, but until consciousness acts on them, nothing comes into material being. And in 1899, Max Planck, in his receiving of his Nobel Prize, he said this: "As a man who has devoted his whole life to the most clear-headed science, to the study of matter, I can tell you as a result of my research about atoms this much: there is no matter as such. All matter originates and exists only by virtue of a force which brings the particles of an atom to vibration and holds the most minute solar system of the atom together. We must assume behind this force the existence of a conscious and intelligent mind. This mind is the matrix of all matter." 1899 he said this, 116 years ago. So consciousness, in this way of understanding it, is no longer seen as a phenomenon emerging from the brain, but actually as the ground of being, in which all material possibilities are held. And of course the ground of being is a term that's been used in Christianity and in other religions too for many years, for thousands of years. There's the idea of the divine presence from which or from whom this whole reality emanates, and this divine presence holds it all in being. Now this matrix of all matter that Max Planck talks about seems to me to fit in exactly with the whole idea of the divine as the ground of being from which everything emanates. And I think the reason why scientists haven't been able to get a handle on what consciousness is because it's outside of the space-time reality, which is all that they can investigate, really. If this mind, the matrix of all matter, is what brings things into being, then trying to get at it with scientific modalities is just not going to work, because that whole understanding of the space-time universe is limiting. And it would seem also that there are no individual consciousnesses. There is only one consciousness of which we're all a part. Now it's not what it seems like to us. There's only one vast field of consciousness in which the universe exists, which holds us and it in being. Our consciousness is all one. An analogy again might help here, which I'll just have some of. A glass of water is but a part of the water present on the whole planet. This water may have been part of the oceans, it may have been vapour it will have been vapour in the sky, rain in the clouds falling, rain on the ground, been in streams and rivers back to the ocean, and on the way may have passed through numerous animals on the way, maybe even some human beings as well, and eventually it gets back into being a glass of water. And yet this glass of water is just contained and fairly still, but it's actually of the same essence as of all the water of the planet. released from the glass, which it is doing now, it's evaporating, it will again become part of the ocean, part of the air, the clouds. It's all one water. There's no such thing as a water. It's all one. And yet, held in this glass, we see it as a separate entity. And so it is with consciousness. It's all one consciousness, but contained within a human being, it feels separate. Professor Goswami says it again. He says, you and I have individual thoughts, feelings, dreams, etc., but we don't have consciousness, let alone separate ones. We are consciousness, and it's the same consciousness for all of us. Consciousness is the ground of being. We cannot turn it off. So, from physicists, we hear that there is a universal field of consciousness which acts on energetic information fields to bring matter into being, into the reality as we know it. This consciousness holds everything in being. It's a divine matrix, sustains everything. And that means that actually not just ourselves, but not just other animals, not just plants, but actually everything has a form of consciousness that holds it in being. From atom to planet, it's all part of the one consciousness. So each individual atom, person or planet has its own measure, its own type of consciousness, if you like. From a rudimentary atom's kind of right to exist to a massive planetary awareness. Maybe the Gaia of the ecological movement is not just a concept but a reality, that there is a divine, huge planetary consciousness. The further spiritual insight is that this one consciousness is aware, it's active, and that there are further levels, higher levels of being, further levels of vibration than this reality in which we exist. And I think the biggest insight to be brought from the spiritual side of things is that the nature of this consciousness is love. Science can't measure consciousness, neither can it measure love. But we know that love is the way to growth and to higher ways of being. There is a viewpoint that love is the evolutionary driver, that love is a kind of force within the universe that brings things into greater relationship. So atoms and molecules are brought into relationship to form more complexity, and that proceeds all the way through the chain of life. We are brought into relationship, into human beings' relationships, and sexuality developed as a means of bringing relationships together. And we're constantly working with love as a driving force to bring us into ever more complex relationships. And you can begin to see that if you view love as a force which brings things together, that it could have been there from the beginning of the Big Bang, behind everything, driving it. And so love becomes part of that consciousness that brings everything to being. Now, as an Anglican priest, this reflects my understanding of the God to whom I relate. I understand God now as compassionate. That's consciousness is the ground of being. But God is as compassionate consciousness. Tying it in with quantum theory, this God is the one from whom everything emanates, and in which or in whom everything is held in being. And we're part of that compassionate consciousness. We have the potential then to awaken to our true nature. And when we awaken to an awareness of the divine compassionate consciousness of which we are a part, then we begin to realize that we are one with all that is. And that's a a term that's been called in different ways, this idea that we are one with all that is. It's been termed unitive consciousness or non-dual consciousness, or even just Christ consciousness. This is the sort of thing that I go into in the book, Blue Sky God. And I believe it's also the aim of many, many spiritual paths to awaken to oneness with the divine, whether that's through meditation or through ecstatic trance or whatever it might be. Now, I'm a vicar out in the wild west of Wales with 5 churches. So how do I go about conveying any of this to the congregation, you might ask? Well, I do try to relate my new way of seeing to the old terminology of Christianity. Because I believe that the path that Jesus was really teaching was a path of transformative love and surrender. I do believe that Jesus was teaching about how to be one with what he called the Father. Really talking about this one compassionate consciousness. My emphasis in prayer is on the practice of meditation, which I think is a way into allowing that transformation, the opening of the heart and opening of the awareness to happen. And Jesus, in his becoming one, he forged a path for us all to follow. And I think he was a wisdom teacher of the path of transformative love, not only teaching it, but making it more possible for us all to follow that path as well. He wasn't necessarily the first one, but he was the first one in the West, if you like. So I'm going to pause there for a minute, because I know that this is a lot to take in sometimes. So for any questions or comments or things people might want to say about the idea of God as compassionate consciousness. Yes?
You say you're an Anglican priest, and I accept that.
Yeah.
What about the traditional beliefs of Christianity? Do you actually believe them? You can do if you believe that. The traditional beliefs. I attended a Pentecostal church for a year and wrote them a letter about what you're talking about, that we're all essentially divine, and we're all one. And I was likened to what's it called? A devil appeared who was an angel of light.
Yeah.
And I was amazed at the church, where there was so much love in the church.
Yeah.
And it was such a vibrant church. You get 400 people in every service. And it appeals to the young ones because they have a band on stage.
Yes.
Rock gospeling and that. And I found I couldn't go there because of the narrowness of thought that Christianity is believing that Jesus died on the cross to atone for our sins, and if we didn't believe that, and if you believed in it and were saved and baptized, you go to heaven, and everybody else is written off.
Yeah, yeah.
It's really
within any religion, there are parts of it that become sort of crystallized and hardened, and I think that's what's happened in the institution of Christianity. But actually, there are many more teachings that are much broader and much more universal than that within Christianity. And the whole idea that Jesus said in John's Gospel about "I am one with the Father, and we are one, and we shall all be one." That's exactly what this is talking about. Yeah.
And Jesus actually taught it.
Yes.
The church doesn't teach it, or not experience.
Yeah.
I had a similar experience to you.
Yeah.
I went to an evangelical church and then left it.
Yeah.
And then I came back to it, and then I found through my own investigation, different books. Thousands, hundreds of books come out in the last years, all saying the same thing in a slightly different way. That there's Christianity seems to have lost it. They don't teach.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's Western Christianity, because if you look at the Eastern Orthodox Church, where the Western Church teaches about sanctification, being made holy and being made to be a bit like Jesus, the Eastern Orthodox Church teaches deification or divinization, which is being made to be one with God. And we've lost that Eastern aspect. The Western Church kind of went down a slightly different route. Somebody had a question? Yeah.
I was just wondering about how aware does one need to be of this thinking? And I'm thinking of people I know who are perhaps not particularly academic, not particularly delving into these things, but actually reveal the compassionate consciousness of the way they're living. Does it matter if we think this way, or is it just a way of being?
The difficulty, I think, with the institutional, traditional Western view is that it is divisive, it's exclusive, whereas this view that I'm putting forward is much more inclusive. And no, it doesn't matter. If you stick to the teachings of Jesus to love your neighbour as yourself, then that's what this is about. It's just giving more understanding and a deeper sort of padding to that as well. I've really been going back to the teachings of Jesus and not listening to what the church has developed that into to get to the bottom of this, really. Any others? Yeah.
It's just an observation, really, about sometimes religion can almost get in the way of this oneness. The way it's the language and the divisive nature of it.
Yeah.
And I think from what you were saying, where you talked about things like meditation or yoga or whatever it might be, different ways to access.
Yeah.
That might not necessarily be classed as religious. So sometimes it's just the language that's used that can be.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's that idea that you were talking about before about it's how it's perceived.
Yeah.
So it's being very aware of the language that you use, I guess, isn't it, as well?
Yes, yeah.
To tap into that.
Yeah, I mean, I was brought back to the idea of meditation as a way of prayer by evangelical charismatic prayer, because we sat and waited on the Lord, as it were, and we waited to see what we received and what pictures we received, and I liked the stillness and the quiet. And so I returned to the idea of meditation or contemplative prayer, which is there in all the mystics and all the teachings of, all the great Christians of the past. Yes?
I was just thinking about how you use the word, you use the word vibration, different vibrations of being.
Yeah.
And I know when I have searched for meaning, in that search, I think possibly I have been in different vibrations, really. So when I feel like almost when things were very literal for me, maybe I was at a certain vibration, but then as I began to feel the energy beyond the words, my vibration just was higher. That's all. So I'm still there, I'm still searching, I'm still there. There's meaning in all of that.
Yes.
It's part of the journey, isn't
Yeah.
it? And for me, it's just that my vibration may have gotten a little bit higher when I'm in that space of just being still.
Yeah, yeah.
Where there are no words in that space.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, we live in our egoic minds, I think, most of the time, and we need that to function in the world. But actually, there are many different ways of describing it, but there's the lower self, the egoic self, the kind of self-centered self, and then there's the higher self, or the true self, or the higher mind, or whatever terms you want to use. And it seems to me that the path of spiritual development is moving your center of being from that lower self to being centered more in the higher, compassionate self. And you can dress that up in all sorts of different ways, but that's actually what the journey is about. And it seems to me that that's a universal concept, and that's what Jesus was trying to teach, a concept which is for all humanity. We've dressed it up and made it into an institutional thing. And so we now have to proceed by sanctification and the gifts of the Spirit, and so on and so forth, whereas actually this is part of the evolution of humanity to come to a higher place eventually. That's the way I see it these days. I know some of you have got to disappear at some stages. I'd like to move on to just the second thing, which this kind of homes in more on on Rupert Sheldrake's theory of morphic resonance. Some of you have probably come across this. This arose out of his study of what it is that determines the form of a body. The DNA in every cell in your body is identical. So when you get these original cells developing in once the sperm and the ovum have fertilized and it starts splitting, every split, they're identical cells. So what determines which ones become liver cells, skin cells, muscle cells, nerve cells, and so on? Well, as I understand it, the current biological theory is that every species of being has a sort of information field called a morphogenetic or form-shaping field, and that determines the form. That it allows it kind of draws the cells to differentiate and become the different parts of the body. Rupert Sheldrake takes this biological viewpoint a step further. He says that this information field that draws things into the form that they are to become influences not just its form, but also its behaviours and its social and cultural systems and mental activity. And it includes this idea of morphic resonance. You know what resonance is, when one vibration sets off another, so the opera singer sings and the glasses smash over there. Sheldrake applies this sort of understanding of information fields. The morphic field for the whole species has a kind of inbuilt memory, is what he says. And it stores information relevant to that species. So there's a species memory that's like a kind of extended mind, based on what's happened to that species in the past, shaped by the experience and the behaviours of previous generations. And morphic resonance is the concept that an individual organism in that species can be influenced by the behaviour of another organism in that species, even though there's no physical contact whatsoever with it, because there's a connection through the morphic field. So any new development or behaviour that's developed by an organism in the same species can be transferred to another organism in that species through this extended mind, this morphic field. So you would expect then that if a member of the species acquires a new skill or habit, then it becomes easier to learn for other members of that species. And Sheldrake cites various experimental and anecdotal evidence for this. I can quote you one little bit. There was a chap called William McDougall who did a comprehensive experiment with rats in a maze in which they had to learn which exit to come out of. The illuminated one gave an electric shock if they exited that way. Biologists like devising these little experiments. But the one which was illuminated kept changing. Now, the first generation of rats made an average of 165 errors before learning which exit to take. By the 30th generation of these rats, only 25 errors were being made before they learnt the new behaviour. Now, you could say that it was genetic then, it was passed on. Following the publication of that, another biologist in Edinburgh, F.A. Crewe, decided to repeat these experiments, but he found that his first generation of rats learnt very quickly with an average of only 25 errors, as if they'd continued where McDougall's rats had left off. And in Melbourne, in Australia, the experiment was again repeated with 50 generations of rats over 20 years, and it showed the same pattern. So you find that this behaviour learnt in one place is adopted by the same species in another place. And that there was various other evidence that he accumulated that proved this. Well, I say proved it, that indicated this. That theory has been received with scepticism by an awful lot of scientists, and if any of you have followed what Rupert Sheldrake has tried to do over the years, you'll know that he's been castigated quite severely for this, but he's still soldiering on with it, and it is becoming more widely accepted. But think about it in terms of human beings. If the theory is correct, whenever a human being does something which goes further than anyone else has gone before, it affects a change in the morphic field for the whole human race and makes that act more possible for everyone else to do. Now, if you assume for a moment that this is the way the world works, that the theory of morphic resonance is correct, then there are profound implications for understanding the life and death of Jesus Christ, who of course looked exactly like that. And the theology of atonement, in fact. Christian theology tells us that Jesus was fully human. So therefore what he did and how he behaved will affect the morphic field of humanity and enable others to do the same. Now Jesus' path, when you think about it, was one of kenosis, or self-emptying. We hear that in Paul's letter to the Philippians, where he says, "Let the same mind be in you that was in Christ Jesus, who, though he was in the form of God, did not regard equality with God as something to be exploited, but emptied himself." And it's that word, kenosis. It's like Jesus was able to transcend that egoic desire nature, that false or lower self, and awaken more fully into God's consciousness, his true or higher self. And yet he was fully human. So he had an egoic nature, and yet the story of his years of ministry show him repeatedly going beyond that ego, beyond that self-centeredness, and becoming one with God, or fully divine, or, as I like to express it these days, as fully divine as a fully human being can be. If he's fully human, he can't be more divine than any fully human person has the potential to be. That just seems logical to me. So he repeatedly emptied himself and surrendered to the process. And that, I think, is the meaning of some of the cryptic words of Jesus when he said things like, "Those who lose their life will find it." Those who let go of the lower egoic desire nature will awaken into their higher self, will find their true self. It's expressed in various other ways in the Bible. St. Paul talked about moving from flesh to spirit, or putting on the mind of Christ, or being transformed by the renewing of your mind. It's all the same thing. And we see that letting go of self, particularly in the temptation narratives at the beginning of his ministry, the sort of thing that we go into at the beginning of Lent, the 40 days in the wilderness, where Jesus is really being, it's put as Satan in the Bible that's tempting him, but this is his lower egoic nature tempting him to do things that, human beings would like to do. And then we see at the end, in the Garden of Gethsemane, in his trial and crucifixion, Jesus faces what he's got to go through. He's tempted to give it all up, and he says, "But not my will, but yours." And again, he's leaving behind that self-centeredness. He's surrendered to the process, put his own ego aside. And that self-emptying kenosis continued in his reactions to the process of the trial, the torture, the crucifixion. He seemed continually emptying of himself. Surrender and self-emptying was his way, to act out of the love and the compassion that became his as he put aside his egoic nature and awakened into this field, this immense field of God's compassionate consciousness. And so then he acted and was energized from that deep well of love, the ground of our being, that is God. And the implication through the idea of the morphic field is that this is possible for all humanity. If you consider it in terms of morphic resonance, Jesus was the first to fully follow the way of transformative love. And therefore he forged a path, and he changed the morphic field for all humanity, and makes it more possible for us all to rise beyond the ego and have this mystical experience of connection with the compassionate consciousness of God. In his life and his death, Jesus modelled that way of being, and so he made it more possible, if Sheldrake's theory is correct, he made it more possible for us all to live in the same way. The morphic field of humanity was altered to enable this new way for us. Jesus established a breakthrough in the potential for all humanity, and it wasn't so much his death that accomplished it as his life which led to his death. If you consider sin as being self-centered, the self-centered egoic life that keeps us separated from God, you could say that as well as dying for our sins, he lived for our sins, which resulted in his death. His death was the consequence of a life of surrender and self-emptying, kenosis. And it was his life that enables us to be brought back into the awakened awareness that we are part of the immense consciousness of God. So instead of being bought back, in Christian theology, redeemed by his death, we are brought back by his life that changed the morphic field for all of us. And the Christian spiritual journey is then to follow the transformative path of loving surrender and kenosis that Jesus blazed and enabled for us all through morphic resonance. To become, if you like, aware and awake and alive. So the idea of morphic resonance gives this a radical new insight really into the atonement. It's based in a scientific theory. It also gives us a further insight that I think overcomes one of the greatest difficulties of Christianity, that it's seen as being exclusive. Because it means, this idea of morphic resonance means that all the great teachers and masters in all the spiritual traditions will have contributed their part to the morphic field of humanity as well. So we get over that exclusivity that is so criticised. So the Buddha and Gandhi and Lao Tzu and Confucius and, all of them will have contributed. All those who reached the spiritual heights and depths take their part, their place in the picture. So when we get into spiritual places through worship, whether it's through prayer or meditation, or get caught up into exaltation or whatever it is, then we're allowing our consciousness to have access to the greater mind of God. And then I think changes begin to happen at a deeper level. Our brains are literally rewired. We make different connections. There's been a lot of studies that have gone on to show that meditation actually does rewire the brain. The different pathways open up. That we are opening up to more intuition, to insight, to compassion. And I do believe that Jesus was the first wisdom teacher in the West of this path of transformative love. He was at the place where he saw reality from a state of oneness, from a state of interconnectedness. And that was what he was talking about when he talked about the kingdom of heaven. This is what he talked about more than anything, the kingdom of heaven. Something that was both within us, nearby, around us, a new way of being in relationship with God. It's the state of non-dual consciousness or Christ consciousness. It's an opening of the heart-mind. It's expressed in the Bible as moving from flesh to spirit, putting on the mind of Christ, being made in the image of Christ, transformed by the renewing of our minds. All these concepts that are there, but when you start understanding them in a different way, they begin to mean different things. It seems to me that recently there's been a global shift starting to happen. That there's something going on in the world. There's a whole global... we live in a global village now, and we've realised that the whole explosion of technology has brought that to our awareness. It's as if the whole of humanity is going through some big change. And to me, this is Jesus' kingdom of God beginning to come in. It's the kingdom of God, or the kingdom of heaven, was not something later. It's something lighter. It's a different state of being. It's not pie in the sky when you die. It's a different, higher vibrational way of viewing. If you like, viewing from oneness, seeing from oneness, a different lens through which to view reality. Seeing from oneness is about knowing that we are all here in this world together. We are all interconnected, and every other single human being in this world is our sister or brother. And if we can get something of that message through, it could transform an awful lot of situations. We actually need to get that message through if we're going to survive on this planet. So the idea of God as compassionate consciousness, I think, was there in Jesus' teachings. He didn't use those words, but so what? You know, words change. We need to develop a new language to talk about the spiritual journey. But he was talking about divine interconnectedness right back 2,000 years ago. To love your neighbour and to love your enemy is about forgiveness and being connected and building relationships. And in the midst of a change, as some tell us, moving from the Piscean to the Aquarian age, in the midst of what seems like a global shift of consciousness, there's an evolution maybe to a new way of being happening, a seeing from oneness. So the idea of God as compassionate consciousness seems to me to be able to bridge a gap between science and spirituality. And it gives it a huge big tick to developing meditative and contemplative prayer practices. Gives a new way of thinking about what the spiritual path is about transcending the ego and becoming awakened to the presence of the one in whom we live and move and have our being. I'm so glad St. Paul said that. There's a whole ingrained institutional viewpoint that does need to shift. You know, I still have to use the liturgies that are prescribed, unless I get bishop's specific permission to do something different. And those liturgies enshrine the institutional viewpoint. And I do find that difficult. I have to reinterpret things. You know, I lead services in fairly traditional churches. But I think that the more we can put forward that actually what Jesus was teaching was a path of transformation of the heart, the more we can begin to change the institutional way of seeing things. Because I believe that's what Jesus truly taught, that he was the first wisdom teacher on that path of transformative love, and that he saw from oneness. And that our paths are to become aware and awake and alive. So really what I'm talking about is awakening. to compassionate consciousness, which is the one in whom we live and move and have our being. Now, I'm going to finish the talk there, but what I'd like to do is to maybe give you a chance to talk to each other for a few minutes and then see if there's any questions that come out of that. I think we've got about 25 minutes left. So if we said meet into sort of 3s or 4s where you are now for maybe 10 minutes or so, share ideas, share viewpoints, think up maybe 1 or 2 questions, and then we'll come back and have a bit of a plenary session. While we're doing that, I'll just give you a plug for the book. You always have to do that. There are copies over there. There's some Cana leaflets and things over there as well. Christians Awakening to a New Awareness. Well, what I did with the book was to take the first part of it, the first nearly half of it, is 4 scientific theories. One about this quantum reality and God as consciousness. A chapter about epigenetics and healing and prayer. Morphic fields and the works of Christ, and then a chapter on light as well, and how we can see that in spiritual and scientific ways. And after those 4 kind of scientific chapters, I then go into the evolution of Christianity, the way in which I think Christianity needs to change and develop. Rethinking Jesus, revisiting the kingdom, salvation evolved, spiritual evolution, the evolution of religious language. And one of the things I did was look back at the Aramaic language which Jesus would have spoken, and the work of Neil Douglas Klotz, which some of you may be familiar with. And I'd quite like it if at the end to use a reworking of the Lord's Prayer that follows the same sort of pattern but goes back to the Aramaic and the broader sense that it would have had in that language. But it's all indexed, and lots of quotes and references and so on in there if you want to explore it further. But let's have some feedback. What questions have you got? Yes?
I thought your scientific explanations were fantastic. You can tell you've got a background in that. But I don't know whether or not you're really trying very hard to tie yourself in knots and square the circle to make the leap to religion and a God. My point is that I agreed with you all the way down in that we're sort of go right down to the tiny atoms and the sort of particles and so on.
Yeah.
And Planck may have thought that it was evidence for some sort of higher creator, but he only had that as an assumption. There was no guarantee of that in his view. And it seems to me that now we have so much conflict in the world with different religions and different subsects, like this gentleman here has mentioned. You yourself have problems, by the sounds of it, espousing some of the old doctrines. We seem to have put handcuffs on ourselves. My question is, why do we need a God to try and grasp this spirituality that you're talking about? If we're all searching for meaning, truth and purpose, then why wrap that around some omnipotent being when organised religion is probably the biggest source of conflict and hatred and misery that we've got in the world?
I mean, that's a good question, really. Why have a God? There are many who try to talk about spirituality in terms of the universe or the source, which is just another name. We get so hung up on language, I think. And God, God has almost become a dirty word in some circles, and so it's avoided, because if anybody sees the word God, it puts them off. Whereas if they're talking about the spiritual journey, then they might be very interested. But as soon as you see God, you think institution, you think church, you think all the things that church has done wrong in the past, all the conflicts and so on and so forth. Most of this, it seems to me, is about human understanding and human nature, and living in the self-centeredness of human nature rather than the higher compassionate place, which is what the journey is actually about. Most of the world is still in that lower kind of tribal way of thinking. And the understanding of God in the Old Testament comes from that tribal way of thinking, that God is our God of our tribe, and if we win a battle against the next tribe, then our God's stronger than their God. If we lose a battle, then either their God's stronger than ours, or we're in disfavour with our God in some way. That's where a lot of religions come from, that kind of tribal way of thinking, and takes so long to rise above that. And in many ways you can still see that humanity, a large part of it, is stuck in that way of thinking. So we get ISIS, so we get football violence. It's tribal way of thinking, and there has to be a path that takes us beyond that. And the highest of all the forms of religion does take you beyond that, I think. I don't know whether that's answered the question. It's not answerable, but... sorry, yes.
It's really interesting because what you said there, I thought you did the opposite to what you were saying. I thought you brought it all together and connected it all, which for me is really interesting because, like I said before, language can be quite divisive, but how you married the science with the spirituality and then brought the religion into it, and how you could have your own perception, like you're saying, of how to get to the higher space without excluding other religions.
Yes.
You used the example of Jesus, but you also mentioned that Buddha would be on that matrix as well. All these scientists or whoever would be on this matrix together, that would lead into this higher place. So I found it brought it all together for me. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. Other questions? You had one? Yeah.
Yeah. I think the gentleman over here talking about having a problem with God and religion, I understand that. And it doesn't really matter if you forget the word God, which has connotations for all of us, good or bad. If you think of it as consciousness, awareness, or mind, the Christian Science, all is infinite mind and its infinite manifestations.
Right.
I just think that's a lovely way of putting this infinite intelligence compared with the egoic intelligence. Because, as you said, the egoic intelligence is just a five-sensory mind, really based on survival and tribal instincts. And it's gone from that five-sensory mind, which is still a part of the God mind, to that higher mind, which is, if you've ever had, well, I've had a couple of glimpses of it, it just takes you completely out of normal thinking.
There's a pastor in America called Paul R. Smith. He's written a book called what's the title of it? Integral Christianity. Yes, Integral Christianity. And he takes the idea that these sorts of ideas, but he's moved his church from being a Southern Baptist church 40 years ago to this kind of open, integral place that it is now. And he uses, as part of the liturgy, a three-part movement which goes infinite God, in whom we live and move and have our being, intimate God, to whom we relate, and inner God, something like I am the light of the world or something, So he's got those three aspects of God, if you like, a kind of Trinitarian view: infinite God, intimate God, and inner God. And that kind of retains the balance between thinking that, God is just out there and some remote deity that has nothing to do with this, or God is the one to whom I pray and nothing else. And those two aspects are there in Christianity. The one that we've lost is inner God. And did not Paul say, as you said at the beginning, Christ in you, the hope of glory? And and that's the aspect that's been lost in institutional Christianity. But as I said earlier, retained in Greek Orthodoxy and Eastern Orthodoxy.
And I think, didn't he also touch on the different stages of coming to understand that, the different stages?
Paul Smith? Yes.
Of actually finding compassionate consciousness, how we go through those evolutionary places. And I think you touched on it when you said about the tribe. And of course that is the same in the Hindu religion, isn't it? When they talk about the different stages of being. And and I think what is difficult is, in a way, is that when you are in that space, when you're touching that space in yourself, it's a place that doesn't have any words. So to actually put it into words, it's almost like you're lowering your vibration to actually try and get it into words.
Yes.
And I think that the power of meditating and being with others in that space is that you touch it without having to speak.
Yeah.
And by speaking, you almost lose it.
Yes, yeah. I mean, it's like, the book of Revelation. Whoa. If you've ever tried reading that through, you think, what on earth was St. John on? What had he taken? A few too many mushrooms, I think. But actually, he had this fantastic vision, which you can't really describe, but he's having to put it into words in some way, and he did. But Paul Smith in America talks about stages of being, stages of consciousness and states of consciousness. And you can have a state of consciousness where you suddenly experience this exaltedness or oneness or whatever, but the way in which you will interpret that is from the stage of consciousness that you're at. So if you're at tribal thinking, you will interpret it from that understanding. If you're at a higher level of understanding, you will interpret that state in a different way. And that makes sense to me. That's a helpful way of thinking about it.
And I think it makes sense of the way Jesus actually delivered his parables as well. That people can take them literally, or they can take them at different levels.
Yes.
Or then just, as they understand them.
Yes, I think that's right. That's why he spoke in parables, because they can be understood at different levels. I mean, teaching in the church these days, I always ask people, what do you think the inner meaning of this parable is? I mean, we can see what the outer meaning of it is. What's the inner meaning? So, the sheep and the goats, where the sheep are divided and from the goats, and the goats go to burning and everlasting hell, and the sheep go on to everlasting presence with God. What's that about? And I started thinking, well, maybe the sheep and the goats is an internal thing. So the goats are the lower desires that we really don't want to take on with us when we go on, and the sheep are the virtues that we develop as we go through life. And so when we pass on to the next stage, so the goats are burnt away from us, and we go on with the virtues, the sheep, and you apply it as an inner meaning rather than an outer meaning. You apply it to yourself, and that's the power of parables, is to be able to do that. Yeah. Yes, Jonathan.
If we then relate to compassionate consciousness, do you think there's still a place for worship, devotion, and a sense of personal relationship? Can you have a personal relationship with compassionate consciousness?
Well, I mean, as we were saying, love is about forming those relationships. And I think Christianity is more about relationships than anything else, to be honest. It's about relationships with each other, how those develop, and it's about relationship with the divine, the oneness, with God the Father, however you interpret that. So yeah, I still do think there is a place for communal worship as well, in that we are joining together in relationship. You have to then, I wrote in the back of the book a consciousness Eucharist. So I took a standard form of Eucharist and I rephrased it all into my way of thinking. Whether anybody's ever used it or not, I mean, I've used it a couple of times, but it's something that is there for people to have a go with. And I do think that liturgy has its benefits and is useful, but we need to rephrase the whole lot. And I'm sure, and I know you're very creative here in this church, I'm sure that goes on quite a lot. Yeah.
Sorry, I'm just going to come back to your preaching in the church. So do you preach this stuff in the church?
Some of it. Yeah.
Some of you have been excommunicated.
Yeah. Some of it. I mean, I come from the scriptures, in actual fact. So, when Paul said, God is the one in whom we live and move and have our being, how does that relate to the world that we understand today? And I have actually gone into this understanding of us as interconnected energetic fields because of that, and people think, oh, never thought of it that way, And you begin to sow the seeds. So yeah, a lot of the time I stick with building people up in the way you would normally expect, but yeah, there are some things I don't preach about. The wrath of God is one of them. I think that's Old Testament understanding, and I don't agree with it at all. The second coming, I've reinterpreted altogether as the global change, the global evolution that's actually happening, that Christ is born in every one of us, if you like, the Christ consciousness coming into being. For the most part, people just think, yeah, okay, that's interesting, or they don't say much. Well said, Vicar, you know. Any others? Yes?
I just feel there's a bit too much hierarchy in Noah and Alpha.
Yeah, difficult one.
Maybe something to do any suggestions to make it seem a little bit more...
Surface or deeper, maybe, yeah. Yeah, I know what you mean. The idea of lower and higher is kind of hierarchical, and I sometimes... we struggle with words again.
What about stages of development?
It's stages of development, yes. And maybe it's about a deepening rather than a heightening, and getting to the deep places of spirituality. Yeah, maybe that's a way of phrasing it. Yes.
Any question? Well, I've never heard such a good proof of the existence of God. That's one thing. With consciousness, if consciousness brings things into being, that's quite helpful. But I'm wondering why you think that we're evolving into it when we look around the world and it looks as pretty bad as it ever was.
Well, partly because we're saying that it's as bad as it ever was. Why are we saying that? Because we're realising that it is really bad and things need to change. And that there's an aspect of looking at it that says that if the sort of human consciousness is rising, then it will highlight the lower parts because it seems so awful. I mean, you've only got to go back 500 years and you find Christianity doing exactly the same things as ISIS are doing now. You know, and so it seems to me that we have evolved, but there are still those who are still back at that level, and things need to move on and to change. And it's hugely difficult problems, hugely difficult. But there does seem to be a change going on. I mean, I think the whole influence of global technology at this time is changing the way we think, because we now know that we are one world. We're faced with an ecological crisis. We're faced with knowing exactly what's going on at any part of the world. We can look it up, we can Google it, we can find out how people are suffering, how systems are not working, and so on and so forth. So we're faced up with the idea that we have to change. You all know that. We don't quite know in what way we've got to change, but we know that things have got to change. We know that in facing up to ISIS, it can't just be the old way of let's go in on the ground and just obliterate them. We can't do it that way anymore. We've got to find a new way. We've got to cooperate with people that we wouldn't cooperate with normally. You know, and it's difficult, it's hard. There are many compromises to be made, but a new way has got to be found.
So if you say that in a way that when you were talking about the different fields, are you saying then that the way to do that isn't to go out there and do huge things in the world, but to focus on your own responsibility to your own life and your own awakening to compassionate consciousness? Because I guess if you start here rather than go out there, if you start here and you really affect change here, then the hope is then that you will be offering that.
Yeah.
The more of us that do that, you'll be offering that. Is that what your message?
I was very... I know we need to finish, so I'll just say this, but I was very involved in the Ecology Party, the Green Party as it is now, back in the late 70s. And then I was I came to the point of thinking that actually people need to change themselves before they can change the world. And so that's how I came into Christianity, with that understanding, and that's kind of where I am now, that we need to change ourselves before we can change the world. Otherwise we're just doing the same thing over again.
I suppose in a way that's the only thing we can effectively change.
Yeah. One very last point then.
Just to say, that point you just made at the end is actually going to be the topic of another topic.
Oh, right.
Here in 3 weeks' time, which I'm going to is the state of the world, is God the problem or the answer?
Right.
And if I could just add, your problem with your business, you have to stick to the order of service. Very unfortunate, but here in St. Bride's, somehow it's not like that. We did actually stick to the order of service once a few weeks ago. I'm amazed.
Very good. Sounds like you've been freed up here. That's good. Could I just finish with this version of the Lord's Prayer, just as we close? And this is taken from the Aramaic, giving the wider meaning of the prayer. O breath of life, who flows in all creation, may the light of your presence fill the universe, your way of being come, your desire be done in this and all realms of existence. Bring forth the nourishment we need for this day. Forgive the failures that bind us as we let go of our hold on others' failures. And let us not be satisfied with the surface of life, but deliver us from wrong paths. For you are abundant life, creative unity, and glorious harmony through all time and beyond. Amen. That's the kind of liturgy that I'd like to use. Thank you very much.